All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome again to Chapter 7 of The Broken Blade. I think Chapter 6 was pretty awesome. Had a nice defining moment, I think, for Pierre. Hopefully, we had a good discussion about it, and I hope you're liking what's going on. This chapter is called The Long Sault, S-A-U-L-T. It's a French word, and it has to do with a long rapids. Okay, that they were crossing. And remember, the voyageurs, the companies, in this particular case, it's the Northwest Company, did not allow them to travel up a rapids or down a waterfall. They had to portage around it, and portaging really stunk. Now they were supposed to do this. Didn't mean they always followed the rules. This is what they were expected to do according to their company, their boss. So, the Long Sault, Chapter 7. An hour later, the brigade reached a second rapids. They tracked this stretch of water, pulling each craft up the rapids with a 60-yard line. One man stood in the bow, that's the front, and two in the stern, that's the back, using setting poles to steady the canoe in the swift current. The rest of the crew danced from one slippery rock to the next as they hauled their 5,000-pound load upstream. All right, remember I told you they wanted to avoid portaging. That's pulling over and unloading the canoe and carrying all the stuff out. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. So here, they're literally pulling the canoe upstream with all the guys out of the canoe. They have ropes attached. All right, this has got to be pretty dangerous. If any of you have ever stepped on some rocks on a stream, you know how slippery they can get. Fed by the ice fields in the north, the Ottawa River ran deep and cold. Since Pierre was hot and sweaty from paddling, the chilly water felt good at first, but after only a few steps, he lost the feeling in his feet, and the wet tracking rope cut into his right hand. Near the head of the rapids, just as Lalande and Charbonneau were pulling hard to swing the long birch bark hull clear of a menacing boulder, Pierre slipped and wet himself to the waist. His high-pitched squeal gave the crew good reason to chuckle. As Pierre scrambled back to shore, Charbonneau called out in mock anger, "No swimming on company time, LePage. There's work to be done." "Be careful, Tadpole," Bellegarde chortled from the bank. "There's some hungry turtles in this stream," the crew roared. Pierre scowled. He was freezing cold and feeling sorry for himself. He could easily have been swept downstream and drowned. Yet they were laughing, as if he were a circus clown. But when they saw Lalande grinning at him, Pierre looked down at his soaked pants and his skinny blue ankles. Realizing how silly he must look, he couldn't help chuckling along. As they pushed out into a broad pool at the head of the rapids, Pierre studied the river bottom. White sand and bright quartz-flecked pebbles glowed in the shallows. Just where the bottom fell off into sudden blackness, he saw a speckled tail of a huge brook trout. As soon as they hit the open river, the paddlers fell into a stroke a second pace. Pierre's sore hand began to ache. He tried hard to keep up, hearing his father's words, "You'll find no better friends than your canoe mates if you do your part." The day grew hot. Pierre's skin itched as his pants dried in the sun. Blue flies, excited by the blood smell from Pierre's hand, buzzed over the canoe. The heat made Pierre dizzy. He felt almost as sick as he had 2 winters ago when an earache came on so suddenly that he cried. He was fine 1 minute, and then his head began to pound, and he felt as if someone was shoving a hot pin into his ear. He got so feverish that his eyes wouldn't focus, and according to his mother, he started to say silly things, rambling on about his Aunt Millie and a pig in a silver snuff box. Though Mother and Camille bathed his forehead with cool rags all night, the pain didn't go away until the middle of the next morning, when his eardrum burst. Youch. That's gotta hurt. Though Mother was afraid he'd be deaf in that ear, his hearing gradually came back. Just then, a deer fly bit Pierre between the fingers of his right hand, and he dropped his paddle to dig at the throbbing bite. "What's the matter?" Belvoir teased. "Does our puppy have fleas?" Pierre flushed, but he made no comment, as the crewmen on all sides had another laugh. Just once he wished he could dunk Belvoir's ugly face into the river. He tried not to scratch, but that made the itching more maddening. Pierre envied the older men with their long hair, which kept the flies off their necks and shoulders. Luckily, there was more bull work this morning than paddling. If he was careful with his tracking lines, his cuts just might start to heal. Just after they tracked their canoe up a tight chute bordered by lichen-covered rock ledges, Charbonneau gave Pierre advice that didn't seem to make sense. "If the paddling seems hard, Pierre," he said, "it is only because you make it so. To paddle properly, you must forget you are paddling." Need to adjust this just a teensy-weensy. There we go. Pierre frowned as the steersman continued. "It may sound crazy, but it works." "Tell these blisters they don't hurt," Pierre said. Charbonneau's tone angered him. The men seemed to think that all it took was an order to make a thing happen. "The pain will pass," Charbonneau snapped impatiently. "I must warn you. We hit the big water soon. To paddle 15 hours a day, the head and the heart must be strong." When they stopped to recoil their lines a little later, Lalande took Pierre aside. "Listen to your steersman," he gently urged. "The truth is a strange dog sometimes, but work is only as hard as we make it. Focus on a special place, a Christmas long ago, the bonnet of a pretty girl, and your paddle becomes a small thing." He admired Lalande's calm. Pierre could tell the bowsman encouraged him to try it for his own good, where Charbonneau was only worried about how many miles the brigade would make. When they took up their paddles again, Pierre tried to follow his advice. He studied the pines along the riverbank, but his hands still hurt. He recalled his last time with Celeste, but even as he imagined her bright blue eyes, his ears burned at the memory of his awkwardness. The more he thought about the advice, the more foolish it sounded. He'd never made a job easy by forgetting. Forgetting made his mother angry. How many times had he been sent out after supper to finish a chore he'd forgotten? "It isn't fair for the chickens to go hungry because you're lazy," she'd say. The brigade finally stopped for breakfast at the base of a rapids. There was a short but steep portage. As the canoes coasted up to the landing, Pierre noticed that each man briefly doffed his cap. Took it off and held it off their head in respect. He looked up and he saw a series of faded red crosses standing on top of the hill. He'd heard about these crosses left in memory of voyageurs who drowned, but he'd never seen one. After the men unloaded, Pierre studied the white trough that roared down the boulder-strewn channel. He was awed that anyone could ever attempt such a run. He looked back up a hill and he asked Lalande, "How many crosses are there?" 19, as of last fall." "Well, how many died? Right there, right here." Lalande nodded. In the pool below the rapids, Pierre watched a beaver-gnawed stick bobbling in the foam. It was easy to imagine a dead man face down in the flotsam, spinning in a low circle. Spinning in a slow circle, I'm sorry. Why would anyone try to run these rapids? It's a tough carry, was all Lalande would say. Voyageurs don't do it anymore, do they? Well, it is forbidden by the company. The flat tone of Lalande's voice hinted that this was a policy not always obeyed. Pierre pictured himself alone in a canoe hurtling down the white channel, flailing with his paddle. You've never run it, have you? Well, there was a long pause. When Lalande finally spoke, his eyes were fixed on the red crosses. It is a tough carry, he repeated. Breakfast was the same as dinner, and the same as every meal would be for the next 6 weeks. Boiled corn and salt pork. Yuck. Pierre nibbled at the first bite, and only then realized his hunger. He devoured his heaping plateful, not caring whether it was corn or oats or hay. Food helped drive the paddles, and he needed strength. When it was time to portage, Pierre carefully inspected both his parcels. Catching him with his hand beneath his pack flaps, Le Petit teased, "What you fishing for, Pierre? I think you have better luck if you try the river." "You know what I'm looking for, La Petite," Pierre said. "No one's tricking me again with an overloaded pack." "So, I will have to find another pony to place my wagers on, eh?" So Pierre doesn't learn from his first portage. He's checking, make sure they haven't overloaded him. "That's right. Well, here's your slice of the pie." And with a big laugh that echoed up the rocky channel, he tossed Pierre a coin purse. Then, as Pierre was getting ready to hoist up his pack, Lalande took him by the arm. "And here's a little present from me." Lalande, his blue eyes lit with excitement, handed Pierre a sheath knife. The handle was carved caribou horn, and it had a moose hide sheath decorated with colored beading. "I couldn't take such a fine—" "You deserve it. You won the wager for us." "But this is too much," Pierre protested. "Well, I promised you a share. Besides, I made it myself. It's a winter hobby of mine. A knife means more to a boy than a sack of coins, right?" Pierre nodded, awed by the gleam of the honed edge. "Besides, we white-hairs got to stick together." Lalande grinned, ruffling Pierre's hair. "Just don't cut your hand off. Your mother would skin my hide." When Pierre had both 90-pound parcels in place, he was amazed at how light they felt. The balance was so much better than the pack that they tricked him with. That one rode low on his hips and put a strain on his back and neck. These sat high and let him carry the weight with his legs. The rest of the day passed quietly in a mix of brief paddling stints and work with the tracking lines. Most of the men were suffering from the previous night's celebration, and they looked peaked. Bellois, complaining so loudly that the whole brigade could hear, claimed his mouth tasted like the inside of a British boot. The only excitement occurred late in the day, when La Petite's bowsman suddenly drew out his northwest gun, and he fired towards the shore. There was a furious flapping of wings, and after the smoke from the musket charge drifted downriver, Pierre saw a duck floating on the water. The canoemen cheered when the man tossed his kill to the cook. Andre Bellegarde. "Meat for the cooking pot," Lalande called out. Emile, grinning hungrily, yelled, "Duck soup!" Bellegarde stood up in his canoe, limp carcass in hand, and bowed dramatically to his benefactor. "Fine shooting, monsieur," he said. So, it looks like they're going to have something other than boiled corn and salt pork to eat. Let's see what happens.